Howdy, everybody. Looks like we got a few folks joining us. Welcome. Thanks, everyone, for showing up. Really appreciate it. I'll probably say this several times, but howdy, my name's Hop Hopkins. I'm the Executive Director for WildEarth Guardians. Thank you so much for joining us. We've got a few folks. The numbers continue to come in. We'll wait just a few more minutes until we get everybody on board, and then we'll go ahead and get started. While you're waiting, again, my name's Hop Hopkins, the Executive Director for WildEarth Guardians. My pronouns are he, him. I'm coming to you live and direct from Tonga and Chumash unceded and occupied territory in what is now called Southern California, just outside of Pasadena, California. And what you all see is we're trying a little bit of a different format today. We're doing a classic Zoom meeting outside of the webinar style. And once we get a critical mass of folks, I'll go over a little bit of our community agreements about how we'll be in community together in order to make this a wonderful and fabulous experience for us all today. Joining me today, we have Chris Smith, our Wildlife Program Director, and Lizzie Pinnock, our Coexistence attorney. We'll be talking about coexistence today. We're really looking forward to it, and we really appreciate y'all showing up today. So we'll wait just a few more minutes for folks to come on in. How you doing today, Chris?
I'm doing well.
Lizzie, how you doing? Oh, sorry, Chris got more to say.
No, I'm hanging in.
All right, Lizzie, how about you?
I'm doing pretty good today.
Right on. Jim, good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Glad to be here.
Right on. Let me run through the panel here. We got about 3 panels. Some people have their screens on, some people have them off. And it's a little dark there, but I can make out your face. Looking pretty good. Thank you. Alan.
Hello.
Looking good. Kathleen.
Sorry, it's dark in Ireland.
No, oh, Anne joining us all the way from Ireland. I appreciate that. No worries.
Yes,
No
hello.
worries.
Yes, nice to finally meet you. Sorry, it's very dark here and I'm just getting home from work.
All right. Well, you know what? We've got about 4 or 5 Anns. We got a couple Annas. There you go, Anna. I like that lighting. You got that classic photographic look there. Right on. All right, all right. We're up to about 70 people now. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, and folks can join in as they come on board. Again, my name is Hop Hopkins, Executive Director for WildEarth Guardians. This is my first WildEarth Guardians webinar. And I think for many of the staff here, it's our first webinar that we've done as a Zoom meeting. I really like Zoom meetings because I get to see all of the wonderful people who are here in the webinar. It's just 3 talking heads or 4 talking heads or 1 talking head, and it makes it really hard to really get a vibe for what's going on with folks there. And I'd like our community to be able to see who's here. Otherwise, I would have never known Anna was calling us all the way from Ireland, and it was dark where she was. So I'm so pleased that we were able to have that moment. And I'm going to go over a few logistical things because this is a new format for everyone. And so just to make sure the meeting runs smoothly, I'll talk a little bit about that. Again, Hop Hopkins, new EB here. I'm calling from occupied and unceded Tonga and Chumash territory in Southern California. And so what we're doing here, ideally we had about 200 people sign up, and typically that number falls off a little bit. So hopefully we'll crack 100 participants here shortly. But the way we're going to do this is that we're all here in the checkerboard. You should be able to see a bunch of faces. You may have more than one set of checkerboard faces. I've got at least 4 right now. I may get up to 5 or 6 by the end of the call. So how this is going to work is when we get to the Q&A, you'll be able to unmute yourself and speak into the room. And I'm assuming many people coming on the other end of COVID have experienced a lot of Zoom meetings. So a lot of this will be old hat and won't be new. But I think for our Guardians community, it's a little new. And so there's a chat feature, and I see some folks have already been using it. And that's great. You can add comments there. Hey, Cynthia, good to meet you too. Thanks for that shout out in the chat. we'll be using the chat. And as we're going through this, if you have a question that comes up in the moment, you can put in the chat. Lindsay, our conservation director, and Liz, our senior executive program manager, and Amber Dew will be managing that chat. We'll also be pulling questions from that chat that we can't get to in the session into a Google Doc that we'll then come back to and pull from when we get to the Q&A. We'll also, sometimes folks forget that they're off mute, or they off mute themselves accidentally. If that happens, one of our staff will mute you, or we may interrupt briefly and just say, hey, someone's off mute. Could you please mute yourself? And if not, we have omniscient control and someone will mute you for you. And then when we get to the Q&A portion, if you do want to raise a hand to question, when you go to the reactions button, it's got a little heart above it. It says reactions. You click on that, there'll be some emojis. Feel free to use emojis when you hear something that you like. Like here, I like being here, like seeing all you all, so I'm going to throw up a big red heart. In the reactions bar, there's a raised hand feature. It looks like that. Thanks for the thumbs up, Kathleen. Appreciate you. When you put that hand up, that means you have a question at the Q&A portion. We'll get to it. And if multiple people raise their hands, don't worry, because there's a queue function that pops up for the moderators, and we'll be able to see who's raised their hand and in what order. And then once you've asked your question, please just lower your hand so we don't continue to see that, and then we'll be good to go. I think most everybody's got most of those rules previously in other Zooms they've done, but if anyone needs a reminder, has some challenges with that, hey, Sarah from Baltimore, really appreciate you being here. Appreciate the shout out. We will handle that accordingly. And Portland, Oregon's in the house. Vancouver, Washington's in the house. Seattle, Washington's here. Let's see, someone from Sacramento's here. That's great. If you do want to put a shout out in the chat to say where you're from, it'd be good for us to know how far we go. But I think the furthest person so far might be Anna from Ireland. If there's anybody that's coming further than that to join us here, let us know in the chat. All right, enough of that. Logistics, I think we're good to go. So again, I'm here with Lizzie Pinnock, our Coexistence attorney, and Chris Smith, our Wildlife Program Director. And we're here today to talk about our coexistence work. I'd be remiss if not naming that the moment that we're in post-election, there's lots of feelings across, I'm sure, the spectrum here, from dismay to shock to anger to being solemn to being depressed to WTF. There's a whole host of that, and we welcome all of that in this room right now. We want to bring all of that here and honor the way that we're feeling. But I also want to say that what this means for Guardians and our issues is that our work remains the same. Our work remains defending wild places, wild rivers, in communities, ensuring that they are free from degradation and pollution and environmental destruction from those folks who would seek to take advantage of people on the planet. That has not changed. What I will say, though, is that since I've been here, we've been on a quest to come up with our first strategic plan for the organization, the first plan it's had in 35 years, in order to be ready for this moment. We've talked a lot about scenario A and scenario B. Our staff has thought about what might this mean for us, and what might it mean for us may change as the coming days and weeks become more apparent. What I will say, though, is that many of us remember what the first Trump administration was like in 2016. I think they're much more seasoned and much more clear. That's been made evident by Project 2025 and its stated aims at dismantling many of the political and social and cultural structures that many of us on this call have spent our lifetime working to ensure get enshrined in our democracy. But for us as Guardians, we look at this moment as an opportunity. 16 million people voted less than the last election. And for me, what I don't take from that is depression around that. What I take is that there's 16 million opportunities potentially for us to reach out to people in order to demonstrate that Guardians is here, that we're relevant, and that we can build power in a way to move forward our agenda. So I just want to say thank you all for coming today, despite where you might be in relationship to the election results, but you're here to be in community with us, and I really, really appreciate that. So right now, what I'm going to do is pivot to the panel. But prior to that, I did mention that we did, and if someone could throw the blog in the chat, that might be interesting for folks. After our strategic planning retreat at Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, I penned this blog to talk a little bit about it. And as I said, our staff had been talking about Plan A and Plan B. And in that strategic retreat was an opportunity for us to come together. There had been some transitions. Clearly, John Horning, our previous executive director, had transitioned out. We had a couple several senior positions transition. We've had new people come on board, and the strategic planning retreat was an opportunity for us to come together and be in community and cohere around some strategic North Stars for our organization. And it's that coherence around these North Star goals and objectives that are going to keep us grounded in really what we're trying to do as the chaos and the instability of the next 4 to 8 years becomes more and more apparent. Guardians is standing true to our mission, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So thank you so much again. I'm going to pivot now to bring in Chris and Lizzie to talk about our coexistence work.
Thank you so much, Hop. It's really good to be here with this community. My name is Chris Smith. I am calling in from my hometown of Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is very close to where WildEarth Guardians was founded, where we began our work. It is historically Tewa-speaking territory, and there are a lot of people among us who have been disenfranchised by our nation's history here. So I want to recognize that. I'm our wildlife program director, and given the challenging moment that we find ourselves in, I did want to try to lighten the mood a little bit and share some of our most recent wildlife wins. They seem to be racking up over the last couple of weeks, so I'm excited to talk about them briefly. About 2 weeks ago, we scored a big win in the 10th Circuit for both black-tailed prairie dogs and one of the most endangered mammals in North America, which is the black-footed ferret. We brought this case with Western Watersheds Project and Rocky Mountain Wild, two of our really good partners. We challenged the U.S. Forest Service's 2020 management plan for the Thunder Basin National Grassland, which had sought to use aggressive lethal management tools against prairie dogs across the landscape. And black-footed ferrets rely upon prairie dogs both for a food source, but also they use their burrows as dens. So we argued that this plan would have disastrous impacts on not only the target, which are black-tailed prairie dogs, but also endangered black-footed ferrets. So the 10th Circuit agreed with our argument on all grounds, overruling a lower court's decision and saying that the federal government violated both the National Environmental Procedures Act and the Endangered Species Act in its plan, and the court sent the case back to the lower court for a new finding consistent with the decision and the best available science. So really happy to announce that. Last week, we won our lawsuit against Wildlife Services in Montana for their failure to assess impacts of their predator damage program on grizzly bears. They now have to go redo their environmental impact statement and take grizzly bears into account more seriously by 2026. And then just yesterday, we had another big win up in Montana that Lizzie, who I'll introduce shortly, had a lot to do with. We filed a lawsuit last year to protect threatened grizzly bears from out-of-control wolf trapping in Montana. And in succeeding in that lawsuit, we dramatically shortened the trapping season in Montana in 23-24, saving both wolves and grizzly bears. This spring, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals largely upheld that decision. And then just yesterday, Montana adopted similar regulations as they had last year due to our lawsuit, which means that this season's trapping is also heavily curtailed. So we are still saving bears, we're still saving wolves, we are still saving black-footed ferrets and prairie dogs, even as we confront challenges upcoming. One of the campaigns that I want to focus on here that fits into our current paradigm of re-envisioning the American West through a lens of wildness and equity is also a continuation of some of Guardian's most important work around grazing and livestock and public lands and wildlife. And Lizzie and our legal team have been laying the foundation for this effort for nearly 2 years. Lizzie, before we get into some of the details of this campaign, can you first briefly introduce yourself and then tell us what the why is for this work?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. My name's Lizzie Pennock. I'm our carnivore coexistence attorney. I am calling in from where I live in Missoula, Montana, which are the homelands of the Salish and Kootenai peoples who still live here today. The why of this work really gets down to humanity's responsibility. We have wildlife just trying to move through their day to day, and they encounter countless dangers on the very human-dominated and increasingly human-dominated landscape, also in the midst of so many other environmental and biodiversity concerns that we are collectively facing. So in light of this, it's more important than ever that we support our wildlife and our native carnivores' inherent right to thrive in wild places. And that's really where our coexistence work, that's where it comes out of, is protecting that right for them to not just exist, but to thrive. So our coexistence campaign, it's not limited to wilderness, but that's where I want to start when we're talking about coexistence with native carnivores. Wilderness areas are federally designated protected areas. And I mean, you can tell from the name, this is somewhere that wildlife should be allowed to thrive and to live out their days in relative safety compared to other places that are more human dominated. This is where we need to prioritize their needs. Yet, commercial livestock grazing still occurs in wilderness areas. And this is because of a loophole in the law, which I'm going to talk about shortly. But when commercial livestock are grazing in areas like wilderness that are occupied by native carnivores, this puts those animals, especially wolves and grizzly bears, in jeopardy. So I'm sure many of you are asking the very good question, why is there commercial livestock grazing in federally protected wilderness areas? And that's because when the law passed in 1964, there was a loophole written into it, which said that so the broad prohibition is no commercial enterprises in wilderness areas. The loophole is an exception to that rule. And that says the grazing of livestock where it was established before September 3rd, 1964 can continue. And that's the day the Wilderness Act was passed. As a result, today, we have commercial livestock grazing on about 13 million acres of federally protected wilderness areas, which is a land mass roughly the size of the state of West Virginia. This includes grazing on the Alto Leopold Wilderness in New Mexico. Over 200,000 acres are allotted for grazing. This is also where the incredibly endangered Mexican wolf lives. We also have, closer to where I am, almost 100,000 acres allotted for grazing in Idaho's Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, which is some of the best wolf and grizzly bear habitat we have left. So those are just some examples to put this in context. And while the Wilderness Act specifically allows for grazing to continue, it does not provide a similar exception for the lethal removal of native carnivores to allegedly protect those commercial livestock, even though the land management agencies act like it does. This interpretation is something that we're challenging in court, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. But this grazing is so dangerous for carnivores because when there is conflict, we know that wildlife loses. You're muted, Hop.
I had my camera turned off. Now I had my mute. I was trying to give everybody and school everybody on some options about how to operate inside the Zoom, and then I'm the very one who's missing the mark. So I want to just touch a little bit on that, Lizzie. Some of the things that you said in terms of about how wildlife should be free to roam, and one of the ways in which I've heard guardians talk about wilderness is as if it's wildlife's living room, right? And that rather than assuming there'll be conflict, that it will happen in the first place, we should first ask ourselves, why is this interaction between livestock and wildlife default to conflict? Is that inevitable? In other words, given the state of play in which wildlife are in their living room, the livestock is there, what can be done to ensure that conflict isn't the default reaction?
Yeah, I really like that framing. And it gets back to, let's get to the root of what's, leading to these situations in the first place. And that's where we can do some work. So we have done work to get livestock completely off of landscapes, like permit retirement in New Mexico, in the Gila. And then a measure of coexistence that we also advocate for is that there are simply some places that livestock shouldn't be, that our native carnivores should be the priority. So we advocate for that as well. And yet there's many other places where those two, commercial livestock and native carnivores, are going to share the landscape. And that is where we can get some work done. So recognizing that, the reality that livestock are out there on many, many acres of public lands, but the possibilities for how we address that to reduce conflicts, instead of assuming it's going to happen, how do we stop it from happening in the first place? So that's where I get back to some of the work I've been doing on this campaign. So, what we're really working towards is a world where carnivores and native wildlife are respected and seen as the integral piece of the landscape and ecosystem that they are. Coexistence should be the default paradigm, even where grazing occurs, not conflict, or what do we do once conflict happens. If we live in a coexistence world, we're not going to get there, hopefully. So this is our bold but also attainable answer to the question, how can we responsibly share the landscape with wildlife? And what we were talking about in wilderness, which is, no predator killing when livestock are grazing, that is something that we can extend to all U.S. Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management lands that are grazed. This is some of the best habitat we have left in the country, and we need to protect that now more than ever. So to accomplish this, we submitted 2 rulemaking petitions to these 2 land management agencies, urging for them to undergo a rulemaking process at the national level, which would require non-lethal coexistence measures to be in place anywhere that livestock and carnivores are going to share space, and particularly in areas where we know there's going to be conflict because there's been conflict in the past, or it's just incredible habitat for wolves or grizzly bears or lions or coyotes. Or, for example, connectivity areas where grizzly bears are expanding to connect their population. These are areas that we need to especially be protecting from irresponsible livestock grazing. So, those petitions are answering that question at the national level. And legally and ethically, we don't think that native wildlife should be killed for cows, period. And we're taking that to a higher court. Literally, we have a court case challenging carnivore killing in wilderness areas, and also figuratively, the court of public opinion. People don't agree with this. And it's, particularly when we're talking about wilderness areas, these are areas where our priorities need to be different. And then we're going to extend that to all of public lands, especially where there's grazing and carnivores.
Right on. And I want to just touch on that, because I think that's the type of systemic change that Guardians is known for. We're not just focused on kind of, how does that saying goes? And sometimes I mess these up, rearranging the living room furniture or something like that. Or I think is that the right saying? Something like that. People say that, rearranging the furniture in the living room, something like that. We're not about that. We're not just about trying to move the chairs, right? We're actually trying to create systemic change. We're actually trying to drive massive cultural shift. Right, where people think about their relationship to the land and to each other and to our four-legged, our winged, and our scaled brethren, cousins differently, right? And so, Lizzie, can you tell me what does winning look like from that perspective?
Yeah. I mean, for us, winning looks like a massive cultural shift, a paradigm shift of going from an extractive industry in our wild places with our wildlife towards one where we all adopt this coexistence framework. It's our responsibility to share these landscapes in a way that respects and supports native wildlife and its ability to thrive. So That's what we want to see. That's what we're working towards. And we're working towards that on many levels, legally, policy, like I've already talked about, but also more locally and on a smaller scale, working together with people who are already doing some of this coexistence work, who are leading this work. There are local collaboratives in my area who are looking at how grazing can be done more responsibly in wildlife corridors, how we can stop these conflicts from happening in the first place, because we have the tools and we have the knowledge to coexist and to not threaten native carnivores with death every time they encounter livestock. And we're going to take those smaller stories and we're going to weave them together to write the much larger one that is happening at the national level.
That's right. And a lot of that has been consolidated in what I like to talk about, called the bigger we. If folks have been tracking some of the blogs or interviews that I've done, for example, there was an interview I did right at the very beginning, published up a blog through Guardians or the High Country News article. I've been talking a lot about the bigger we. It's not just an idea I had, but it's a much larger conversation that's being had across multiple movement sectors, from the conservation and environmental community to the environmental justice to the climate justice communities, all the way to housing and labor advocates, talking about the bigger we. And the bigger we being this, what you're talking about, Lizzie, is reaching out to those non-traditional partners that are out there doing the work, that have lots of value overlap with what we're doing, who haven't presently been present in our work for one reason or another. And so reaching out across difference, as long as there's value alignment, to bring in different perspectives is what we're about trying to do. So to achieve our goals over the next 4 years, what we're looking to do is really to consolidate our current base and then expand that base by reaching out and broadening and deepening our connections to other folks who definitely live in the Western region, who resonate with our issues. While you were talking, I started looking around for this report that Colorado College did on the recent last year's environmental data statistics, where it demonstrated that Black, Latinx, Latino communities and indigenous communities and other people of color communities have higher resonance with our issues than our traditional base does. And what that says to me is that there are lots of people who resonate with our message, that are out there also doing the work, but not in relationship with us. And that's not the case everywhere. In many other places, in some places, we do have non-traditional partners. And what I mean by that is the folks that you don't traditionally see on these sorts of webinars, or that show up to a Guardians event, or might show up to one of our partners events, but's out there doing that work. And so I think having had the experience of coming up in racial justice and climate justice communities and reaching across and doing that work, I think there's a lot of opportunities for Guardians to expand our base and to become more relevant to folks who are already resonating with our base. So just want to say that work that you're talking about, Lizzie, is critically important, and we're going to lean in on that in the coming years, because what's coming for us in these next 4 years that we've seen from what we experienced in 2016 is that it's going to take a lot more of us coming together in order to withstand the attacks that are coming against people on the planet. So very happy to hear you talk about that, Lizzie, and really appreciate you highlighting that for our audience. I'm going to, Chris, do you have something to say about that, or let's bring you into the conversation?
If you don't mind me chiming in, because that kind of got me thinking, that what you were just talking about takes us back to where the conversation started. We're all kind of grappling with the election results, and there's some interesting chatter in the chat about what people are voting for and why, and you referenced, Hop, that there needs to be a meaningful political home for a lot of people who feel politically homeless. And so our coexistence work will continue to include legal advocacy, legislative advocacy, policy strategies, work at the federal level, work at the state level, work at the local level. And we'll, obviously continue to defend bedrock laws like the Endangered Species Act and, Clean Air Act, Clean Water, et cetera. But we also, it's really apparent now, we have to build a more powerful movement that is going to be durable against not just the challenges that we're going to face under the Trump administration, but the challenges extending even further outward into the future, given the climate crisis and given social unrest and upheaval. And that's what I see here, which is what Lizzie's talking about, which is a meaningful way to push the coexistence movement forward. Obviously, the specific campaign that Lizzie spoke about is just one in a suite of efforts we're pursuing to move the needle towards coexistence. But I think it's a really important one, and one that we need to flesh out more, especially with an eye towards ecosystem health and rewilding and climate resilience, because I mean, that's what people want. People want solutions and answers right now, and that's not what they're getting from our current paradigm. You're muted, Hop.
Oh, darn it. Thanks. I keep muting myself. I got a dog here who's being a little noisy, doing what he does. But I'm so glad you talked about that, Chris. An example of that is I want to bring in the recent trip that you, myself, and Lindsay Laris, who's our conservation director, and Joanna, who's now moved over to the wildlife program from our Wild Rivers program, took to attend BeaverCon. It was a wonderful example of what you're talking about in terms of bringing different communities together in terms of the bigger we to advocate for wildlife, folks from the coexistence world, folks from the water world, folks from the climate resilience world were there. And I'm just wondering if you'd like to tell the audience a little bit about that since you're leading in on our beaver work, Chris.
Yeah, and at risk of kind of repeating myself, I do see our beaver work as, kind of the next phase in rewilding and coexistence, because it's answering questions about immediate human need, along with respecting wildness and advocating for an ethic of coexistence and following the science. And in New Mexico, where I am, we're leading the New Mexico Beaver Project, which is an effort to try to get the state of New Mexico to really invest in beaver coexistence and restoration. And as much as that's, a wildlife coexistence campaign, which it is, it's a climate resiliency effort, and it's a watershed restoration effort. It's a water security effort. And I actually kind of jokingly call it water and climate policy through critters. And it stems from one of the really important messages that resonated with legislators here in New Mexico in 2021, when we were pushing Roxy's law, which ended up banning all trapping and poisoning on public lands in New Mexico. We said that one of the reasons to ban trapping on New Mexico public lands was because these wildlife are being exploited and cruelly killed, not just as sentient animals that deserve to be side by side with us, but because they're also integral parts of a functioning ecosystem. And lawmakers really seemed to understand that. I know activists here get that, of course. And again, that's also the premise of our trapping petition in Nevada, which we submitted last month to rein in the worst regulations of any Western state in the U.S. in terms of trapping regulations, which includes just an abhorrent 96-hour trap check window that threatens mountain lions, another critical ecosystem engineer. And I saw Will Stolzenberg, I think, is here, who wrote a great book called Where the Wild Things Were, and he's helping us advance that petition. So again, it's getting back to this need to not only protect wildlife and animals because of who they are and who they're in community with, vis-a-vis us, but also because our very future relies on these functioning ecosystems and the roles that they play.
That's absolutely right, Chris. And I want to just hone in a little bit because BeaverCon was very interesting because our Anna, all the way from Ireland, it was 500 folks from across the world. It was an international gathering. And I think there were people from Ireland there, Anna, just to say. There were some folks from Germany, from Europe, from all parts of of what we call now the United States were there. And the governor from Denver came to speak. In fact, speaking of what you said in terms of lawmakers seeing the importance of this work, Chris, there are a number of appointed or elected officials that attended that event. I think it is one of those cross-cutting events, and it is one of those examples of the bigger we. I know there was some chatter in the chat about ranchers being educated. What was the rancher who was there, who was a big advocate of beavers, Chris, who did a presentation?
Yeah, that Dallas May, who's also the chair of the CPW commission, who's a rancher who's a real big believer in coexistence and ecosystem function.
Yeah, it was completely and totally wonderful to see the transformation that happened on his ranch, where water was just flowing off of the ranch, and the introduction of beavers and the transition it did in the ecosystem and how that transitioned things. And it was really a great, wonderful event that I was very pleased to be there. We had indigenous folks there. There were a number of different communities that were impacted by drought, and we're looking at beavers to reintroduce them or to protect them in ways in which that could help recharge aquifers and do a lot of ancillary benefits, because we know beavers as being the greatest civil engineers around. Just the reintroduction of them into the environment does a lot to benefit people on the planet. So thank you for that, Chris. And I wanted to also just talk a little bit about one of the things you raised in terms of our political work and what that means. Coming to Guardians, it was really important for me to acknowledge the deep 35-year history of litigation and advocacy that the organization had put together, and looking at ways in which we can expand our impact, and thinking about the way in which social change or systemic change happens on the social, cultural, and political level, right? We have a great litigation program with great policy folks. And one of the things that we're looking at, as I alluded to before, that will help us build out this bigger we, is building out our organizing program. At both events that I was at, our fundraising events, both in Denver and in our hometown in Santa Fe, after my remarks about building the bigger we and where Guardians might be going, holding true to where we've been, but also expanding and building and reaching out to broaden our base, I had several members come up in both settings and say, hey, I remember when I first came to Guardians, I was either part of SNAPU or one of the other organizations that we'd merged with over the last 20 years, and says, I remember going out on holding picket signs and doing grassroots activities and phone banking and stuffing envelopes. And are we going to get back to that? And I answered with a resounding yes. I'd love to have us in this next period really do more on the ground work. And we're going to be working with our organizing director, Rebecca Sobel, in order to figure it out, so that we can, in some selective areas, begin to think about what it looks like to build a base and turn some of our online activists in certain areas to on the ground activists, and begin to engage more deeply in that local work that we know right now is going to be critical to our success. There's a trifecta on the Republican side at the federal level, and we know, just as you were alluding to, Chris, that a lot of this work, and Lizzie, happens at the local level. So we're going to be leaning in, and some of you all who are in some of the places where we're doing some of this work, I hope to meet you all out on the streets doing work and phone banking, door knocking, doing all the things that we need to do in order to build and be in community with each other. And so, again, thanks for sharing that, Chris. And I know we're also doing some critical work to protect and return wolves to more places in the West. Isn't that right? Can you talk a little bit about our work helping bring wolves back to Colorado specifically?
Yeah, I can give a quick update on that. I want to make sure we're good on time here, but as I'm sure almost everyone here knows, we've been working very ferociously on the very, very nascent and small population of wolves that was reintroduced to Colorado this year, thanks to the Colorado voters. That effort has been up and down. We got to celebrate the first pups born in Colorado in many, many years. And then we've also had to grieve the removal and death of several wolves. That's obviously hard to go through, but in many ways, this is to be expected from any kind of restoration effort. And also to be expected is the continued effort by anti-wolf sentiments to stop the voter mandated restoration. So we're fighting in federal court so far successfully to ensure that wolves are allowed to continue to be released into Colorado. And we've been working our asses off behind the scenes with help from some of the great activists on this call. And I know, Hop, you've been meeting CPW commissioners. Our conservation director, Lindsay, has been meeting commissioners. But we've been working to fight back against a livestock owner-led petition to halt wolf releases this winter. We feel like we're in a good position to welcome up to 15 more wolves back to Colorado in the coming months. So that's the update there. And then, of course, these wolves in Colorado are eventually going to meet with Mexican wolves coming up from southern Arizona and southern New Mexico, the Gila bioregion. Right now, there are some Mexican wolves, some lobos outside of Flagstaff, which they're technically out of bounds north of Interstate 40, but we've managed to keep them there so far. And, you know, wolves like the intrepid Asha have been increasingly visiting my home of northern New Mexico. So we, despite setbacks, we still aim to restore the continuum of wolves from the Arctic Circle all the way down to Mexico, like we had in the not too distant past. So that's my little wolf update for you there, Hop. I hope that covers it.
Yeah, right on, Chris. That does cover it. I really appreciate you bringing that in. Lizzie, do you have anything you want to share with us?
Yeah, I am just going to provide a quick summary of everything we've talked about in our coexistence work before we move into a Q&A. So, you know, WildEarth Guardians, we're working in every arena that we possibly can. We're in state court, we're in federal court, we're working on policy, we're doing organizing, we are working in coalition, we're working in community. And that's the way that we get this massive cultural shift that we're talking about. And it's, you know, sometimes it's we're working on an individual species, but at the end of the day, all of our coexistence work recognizes that we're striving to live in a world where we share a landscape responsibly, humanely, with all the kinds of wildlife species that are out there, and we protect them for future generations. With that being said, we are going to do 10 minutes of questions. We, you know, as Hop talked about at the beginning, we know that this is a time of some uncertainty, which may be a generous description of how we're feeling after the election. We are open to 1 or 2 election-related questions, but we really want to focus on everything we've talked about here today. And we have a full webinar on December 4th that is dedicated to post-election and strategies moving forward with this next administration. So with that, Hop, you've got some, yeah.
Yeah, I see there was a question, it wasn't directed specifically at anyone, but is the public allowed on designated public land that has private cattle grazing on it? This came from R.W. Marzula. I hope I said that. I got that correct.
Lizzie, you want to take that one?
Yeah. Yes, those public lands are open. So I had someone ask me once, they were on a national forest on a hike, and they're like, I saw some cows. Why are there cows out there? And I'm like, yes, welcome to Western Public Lands Management. So yeah, there may be some exceptions to this, but I don't know any off the top of my head.
The only thing I would add, which is not necessarily an answer to the question, but as folks here in this webinar know, there's a lot of talk about how dangerous wolves are and how threatening they are. And the reality is that cows kill far more people on public lands than wolves ever do. So yes, you are allowed to be on public lands, whether it's Forest Service or BLM, but I would be wary of some of those cows.
Yeah, right on. Appreciate that. I've got another question here coming out of the chat. Does Roxy's Law apply to wildlife services in New Mexico? I believe that might have come from Jim Furnish. Jim, pretty active today, but appreciate you.
Yeah, I'll take that one. Yes, Roxy's Law, which we passed here in New Mexico in 2021, and a number of folks on this webinar helped with that effort, and went into effect in 2022. That protects all New Mexico public lands, Forest Service, BLM, state lands from commercial and recreational trapping, and Wildlife Services does follow that law. So it indeed does apply to Wildlife Services. Which is huge, because that's millions and millions of acres where not just wildlife finds a home, but you know, people and their pets also enjoy and recreate on.
Yeah, right on. Well, I'm going to take a couple questions. I'm going to respond to some of the things in the chat here. A couple people have to bounce. Hey, see you all later. Thank you so much for being here. If you have to leave early or do your thing, take care of yourself. If you got to get up and go to get some water, go to the restroom, do a bio break, take care of yourself and do that too. Let's see. There was a question I wanted to pull from here. Someone said, why? Someone said something about starting on the half hour. they have to go, they have another meeting and they want to start on the hour instead of the half hour. Well, we're starting at the half hour because I have a pretty significant intractable appointment at the hour. And in order to do these webinars, it's, if you want me on it, then it got to be starting at the half hour. So that inconvenience is being sustained because I wouldn't be here if it started at the hour. So just wanted to say that and recognize that you've got a scheduling, your desire to be here is only beaten by your schedule. So I appreciate that. Someone else put in the chat something about why can't all the nonprofits get together? The chat's moving so fast that I can't find it. Who put that in there? Did someone put that in there? Am I reading that right? Why can't all the nonprofits get together? Come off mute and let me know who you are.
I think Lindsay answered that question in the chat.
Oh, did they? What did Lindsay say? What did Lindsay say?
Lindsay said that we do work with coalition quite a bit, and that especially on more local issues and regional issues, it's a lot easier for us to work in coalition. And I mentioned our Colorado Nature League that Guardians is engaged in, and how, you know, we always look for opportunities to collaborate with other groups. That's something that we certainly recognize power in numbers.
That's right. And in this next period, I think that coalition work is going to be more critically important, and particularly at the local level. And I did see some people chiming in the chat that really supported that, because I do believe we can pay attention to what happens at the federal level. And we do advocate at the federal level through the Clean Air, Clean Water, and our Endangered Species Act. But we know that local is where the real sauce and the juice happens. So there's that. I'm going to go back. There's a question. This will be for both you, Lizzie and Chris. What is the number one thing you suggest we can do as concerned citizens? And that's coming from Bud.
Oh, number one.
I know that's a hard question, Chris.
That is a hard question. You know what? Typically what I tell people, and I'm not straying from this, is you can make a difference in your community as local as you can find it. And by that, I mean, everyone here, and 90% of the people in America can name the president-elect, and then, you know, maybe 50% of those folks knew who their senator is, and another 20% of those folks know who their congressperson is, and then you get down to 5%, you might know who your state senator is or your state rep. But what matters is that you can talk to those who are making decisions in your community right around you. And that's really accessible compared to the real disempowerment we can feel when we're trying to, you know, reach folks in really high decision-making levels. So talk to your family, talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors about the values that you care about. I know that sounds a little trite, but honestly, that's super powerful. And then, you know, in the wake of the election results, I would hold on to the notion that, you know, things are bleak right now, but history is long, and we're in this for the long run. I have a grandniece who was just born last month, and if I can have, you know, doubt, then certainly I need to check that when I'm thinking about people who are going to live on this planet, in this place for many, many decades longer than I am.
Right on. Cool. Let me take another question here. Are you working on any short-term strategies with Biden's Department of the Interior to Trump-proof any bedrock protections that the current president-elect will surely reverse? That coming from David. I think I got that question right, David.
Or what? Do you want to go, Chris?
Well, I think the question is, what are we doing right now in the couple months that we have before the transition happens to really secure, put in bedrock any current environmental protections? I think that's the question.
Yeah.
You should go for it, Lizzie, or maybe Lindsay.
Let me see.
I can go for it. I personally, you know, I have some work. My coexistence work does deal with the Bureau of Land Management, which is within the Department of Interior. Trump-proofing any bedrock protections, you know, we're preparing for what we know is coming. We know it because many of these bedrock protections were similarly threatened last time Trump was in office. So, we're already working in coalition with partners to prepare for any of these things to be threatened, and particularly our bedrock laws and the regulations implementing them. So that's something we're doing right now. The power that Biden has is, I think, a lot more limited in these areas than the power that Congress has, and Congress has been generally pretty ineffective, even these last 2 years. So, yeah, I don't know if anybody wants to add anything to that, or if Lindsay.
Yeah. I'll just add, like, I think one of the biggest things that I'm glad to see that the administration and Congress right now, Senate right now, is recognizing is the need to fill up all these vacancies in our federal courts. I think the biggest impact a second Trump administration can have is on creating more lifetime appointments in the federal judiciary. And I believe right now we have 237 judges that are confirmed. There's very few vacancies. And I think spending the next few months really getting those shored up is something that, from our perspective, from a lot of NGOs' perspective, is going to be hugely important for the future.
Yeah. And it's a great question. I even raised my hand for that. And I think looking at the December 4th webinar, we'll talk a little bit more about what we're going to be doing at the federal level, but I do take your point, and I just wrote a press release advocating the very same thing, that right now we ought to be putting pressure and questioning the Biden administration while we have them still in office and they still have power, that they ought to be doing more in order to secure some of these or at least make it very difficult, if not permanently secure as much as possible, current wildlife and environmental regulations, so that they just don't get undone at day one. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we have our December 4th webinar. And I think it's a great question. It's very forward thinking, and I think that's exactly the type of culture that we are trying to cultivate in thinking about how do we advance our work, even in the face of what might appear to be defeat. So I really appreciate that question. I'm not quite certain who it came from, but let's take one more question. Let's see. I guess I couldn't get out of here without another wolf question. Any chance Northern Rocky wolves will be relisted? So much savagery going on there. And this came from Carolyn Shay. I can't see your face, but you're out there somewhere with that question. Chris, Lizzie, Lindsay, anyone?
I think this is a Lizzie question.
So we have, we've petitioned for Northern Rockies wolves to get relisted, or a Western population of wolves to get relisted. Based on what I've seen so far, I'm not hopeful that the agency is going to do that. We are fighting for it in court, and that is where the agencies lose the most when it comes to delisting these species, because it's often not based on science or logical reasoning. But what I have seen, the basis for the petition to relist Northern Rockies wolves was what is happening in Idaho and Montana, and a lot of bad laws and a lot of bad regulations aiming to kill as many wolves as they can. And still pretend that they're managing them. What the Fish and Wildlife Service said about that was not a endorsement of what the states are doing, but it wasn't as concerned as I think that they should have been if they were really considering these issues. And then, we're looking at Congress having the potential to legislatively interfere as well, which I think we can expect given how the election went. I will say, though, because that was very dire, I work at the state level in Montana on wolves already, and this is something Guardians already knows how to do. We're in state court trying to protect wolves. So regardless of what happens at the federal level, we are doing everything that we can to protect them in the arenas where we still can.
All right. I think we might have time for one more question. No, I think we better wrap ourselves here. I think. Let me see if there's a question that isn't going to take us. Let me see. Trying to scan the chat. The chat's very active. I appreciate that, folks. All right. I think we're going to go ahead and close. I don't think there's another small question that won't take us and make us late for closing. So I think we're going to go to close here. Definitely want to thank everybody for being active in the chat. There are some questions in there that we didn't get to, so our apologies, but you can also email us directly, or you can come to the December 4th webinar. If those questions are relevant there, we'll make sure that we put them at the top of the agenda to get to those questions. Really appreciate y'all being very active. Alexa, we'll catch you later. Thank you so much for being here. But what I want to say is, as I said earlier, we've just come out of and we're coming close to wrapping up our strategic plan, which will be the North Star for organization for the next 3 to 4 years. I'm very, very excited about that. You'll be hearing more about that as we wrap it up before the end of the year. I'm very excited about a lot of the work that we talked about here today and the resonance in the chat with wanting to make sure that Guardians remains relevant and that in this new transition to this new administration that we are thinking about how we can stay relevant and potent and increase our ranks and be more powerful and bigger and better organization, advocating for the places that we love, wild rivers, wild places, moving our climate and energy work forward. So I'm really excited to see a lot of resonance there and a lot of folks in the chat, and thumbs up from folks like Catherine Webster when I talk about the grassroots organizing work, the great questions coming from Anna and Jim and from all the Guardians who've been here for so very long. I really appreciate all of y'all being here for that. I want to take a moment. We wouldn't be good organizers, right? We want to always leave with an ask. Never get an audience like this and not have an ask. And so if someone could put in the chat, I'm not tracking it carefully, but there is a petition that I'd like for Lizzie to talk about a little bit, which she's been driving, and someone can put that in the chat.
Yeah. So this petition is a way to show your support for the work we've been talking about, which is pushing the federal land management agencies towards that coexistence paradigm. Because generally the public supports coexisting with wildlife. And so we want to show that and get as many of our voices together as possible. So add your names to that and join us on that work.
For sure, definitely. I would really appreciate everybody. If you haven't, let's see a raise. Let's do a little group activity here. Reactions. How many people have filled out the? You can raise your hand. Who's already filled out this petition? Oh, all right. I see some hands. Okay, so that means I'm gonna. This is what I'm gonna do. I'm going to stall a little bit so some of y'all can catch up while I'm talking. You can click on that link right now. It doesn't take very long unless you're going to write a very long response for you to click on the link, fill it out, and send it forward. That would be great. We have a few minutes if you all could do that while you're here. And then I have another link I'm going to put in there for folks who have filled out the petition, which is a lot of folks. I'm really appreciative of that. I'm going to go ahead and what am I going to do? I'm going to send up a hand clapping emoji for all those folks and then lower my other hand. Thank you so much for doing that. If I could have that second link put in the chat. Of course, this work has been sustained for the last 35 years by many people like you. And for those of you who are also maybe new to the Guardians, there's a donation link in the chat. This work wouldn't be possible without your continued financial support for this work. And I want to give folks an opportunity to click on that link. And if you haven't already, please do donate. I think earlier on in the chat, someone mentioned, I'm not sure who it was, that there had already been I had mentioned there had been a bill that had already been attempted to be passed yesterday that would make nonprofit environmental organizations considered terrorist organizations. That bill was defeated, and most likely it'll probably come back up in 2025 sometime. And so being able to have a robust financial footing to endure the attacks that will come will be very helpful. So please do what you can by signing the petition and by clicking on the link and donating as you're able to. And with that, I'm going to remind you all again, December 4th, if you haven't, the registration link hasn't been sent out yet. It will be sent out. That'll be where we do a bigger, deeper dive into the election results and what that means for our work, for Guardians, and how we'll be moving forward. So with that, I want to thank Chris. I want to thank Lizzie. I want to thank Lindsay, and I want to thank Amber and Liz and Kevin and Lindsay Bidell and all the folks in the background, all the Guardians in the background who really came together to make this a very wonderful event and leaned in on a request I made to do a Zoom meeting with all the happy faces in the checker box. So I think you all performed really well and behaved yourselves. You too, Catherine, for sure. And so Robin, I see you smiling and you behaved very well too. Although as Guardians, we got here because we actually don't behave very well sometimes. And so I also make some tolerance for that as well. So thank you all very much for making my first webinar as a Guardian, as the executive director, a success. Thank you all so much and have a good rest of your day and a safe week.